Greetings. One of the important things that I have learned in this, my first effort to transfer my this course, AFS 240, from a face class to an online class is that, particularly over a summer period, is that it has been very difficult to get everything done. So in some ways I apologize for that. I do not believe that during this summer period you have gotten the full experience or the full content of what we would like to accomplish with this class, but nevertheless I think we've done pretty well and covered pretty much all the key areas and the key themes. There's an African proverb that states one who lives near the Niger or the Niger should not wash their hands in spittle. This course, AFS 240, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the semester, is one that is one of our core courses for the Africana Studies major and minor. And the reason for that is that we believe in order to have a full understanding and appreciation of the African diaspora, of Africana Studies, the interdisciplinary nature of Africana Studies, we must begin with the beginning of the African experience, and that is what we try to do with this particular course. Provide that understanding. I hope that throughout this process you have learned that Africa, particularly as it sits within the global community, from the past up to the present and into the future, is very much like the Niger was to those West African civilizations. It was the foundation of those civilizations, and it is a resource upon which those Africans could build. It was a resource on which those Africans can build. We hope you see Africa now as the same thing. We hope you see the opportunity that Africa provides as a resource, both in terms of the lessons we can learn from it and the potential that it holds for our future. This last lecture will basically summarize what we have covered and a bit more of what was covered in the last three modules, although in a very brief way. We hope that it makes sense to you, and although we will not cover in any totality the detailed information that is provided in the readings, we will try to summarize in terms of the themes of the things that we hope you get out of it. We begin this semester with an overview of what we'd like to accomplish with Africana Studies courses. At the core of Africana Studies is a human-centered, African-centered, and interdisciplinary enterprise. We spoke of the concept of Sankofa and the importance of understanding our history to allow us to move forward more wisely and prudently. And we also stated that when we focus on the African experience, we're essentially focused on the human experience and understanding the human experience from a particular perspective that is reflected around the world. Interdisciplinarily, we try to cover each of the particular disciplinary areas within any one course. So for this African Civilizations course, our attempt was to explore the ancient African experience mostly from a humanities perspective, a social sciences perspective, a STEM perspective, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as well as a multidisciplinary perspective. Some of these things were covered in more depth than others, and what I hope to accomplish in the next few slides is to highlight some of those areas that we did cover and a few that weren't covered quite as well as I would have liked them to be. so that we can summarize what we hope you have gained from the course. Africana Studies, the humanities perspective. Humanities covers history, essentially history, literature, linguistics, religion, creative and expressive production, and indeed many of those areas, particularly linguistics and religion, and even creative and expressive production, can cross into other kinds of disciplinary areas like the social sciences, the physical sciences, etc. The creative and expressive production, for instance, will cover music, dance. There's this talk about pottery, which actually was covered in the evolutionary linguistics discussion within the textbooks. Carvings, of course, that you have seen, sculptures, paintings, etc. I was not very pleased with either of the chapters on the music, dance, or especially the art chapter that was in volume 2 of the Falola text, mostly because it did, although it acknowledged the fact that it was only a sampling of those particular forms of creative expression in particular communities, it did not share the commonalities as much as I would have liked. So, for instance, to not focus on some of the East African artistic expressions is problematic, just as it is to focus on only one aspect of a West African tradition. That is, unless it is clear that most creative and expressive production, whether it's music, dance, carving, or other kinds of performing and visual artistic expression, is just that. It is an expression of the worldview of the people who have lived it. All expression comes out of an experience. All expression comes out of a worldview, and therefore becomes a way for understanding how people interpret the world. So to see an African dance is not just to appreciate the polyrhythms, the movement, but it is appreciate how those human beings have placed meaning on their world, how they have decided to best interact with their world, with both each other as well as the phenomenal world around them, the environment, the ecology. All artistic expression, all expression of most kinds, from language to dance, to the creation of buildings and communities, are means of expressing one's worldview. I talk a lot more about this in another course that I teach, AFS 345, which is psychology in the African, or psychology in the African American experience. So if you're interested, I look forward to seeing you in one of those classes. Our humanities study our humanities story begins with our story, or history as it's called. I like to call it our story. And the appreciation, particularly in many parts of the continent, that because the written history was less available, although very much available in many places, particularly when we get to about the what should I say? About the 11th to 12th century, we really begin to see more written history, and we must give credit in many ways to the role that the Arab or Islamic immigration had in terms of sending many Arabic scholars into the area, and who were very valuable in writing down that history. But throughout all of that, the oral history has been critical and remains very critical. The image on the right is of a griot, or an oral historian, or storyteller, whose responsibility is, in many parts of the continent, of being the depository of that history. And we have read how sometimes that is disrespected, but the reality is that all history is a telling of a story from a particular perspective. And we may have as many facts as we can muster, but we still end up writing a story based upon our interpretation. So an oral interpretation is really no different in that regard than a written interpretation, with the exception, perhaps, that the written interpretation is now documented in ways that will not or cannot change. We can rewrite history, but that original writing continues to exist. The anthropological and archaeological evidence of history, and now we have even greater tools that can focus on the genetic as well as the cultural history of an area and help us to place meaning on what that history tells us, what that story tells us. I mentioned in the previous slide that language is one of the primary forms of expressing one's worldview, expressing one's philosophy of life. One of the other things I talk about in my psychology class is the idea of the African philosophy of life. Language, of course, is how it is best expressed and mostly expressed. And all human cultures use language to define themselves and to place meaning on what they see as important in the world. In the text, you have read about the various African languages that cross the continent. Some of those languages are derived from right within the continent. Some of those are hybrids of both continental origin as well as the intersection of other experiential groups that have come in. The important thing we hope you take away from that is to understand the diversity of the continent. The diversity certainly in terms of the language families that are listed here: Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, the Khoisan. I wish I could make the clicking sound like those who speak that language do, which was mentioned in one of the texts as one of the probably the oldest language group on the continent, perhaps even the oldest in the world. The Niger-Congo and the Congo Kordofanian. I used to be able to say that easily. The Creole, as we can see around the world, is basically a mixed kind of language system, which in many ways all of these are. The Austronesian as well as the Indo-European ones. What you don't see on there, of course, is the Bantu language system that arises from the Pro-Bantu language or Pro-Bantu people. And you can pretty much all of those in red, the Niger-Congo and the Congo Kordofanian, stop laughing at me, are part of what would be considered a rising out of the Bantu language system. As an expression of worldview, it suggests then that there are differing worldviews that cross the continent, and indeed, in many ways, they are. What we find is that there are commonalities that run across all human cultures. There are commonalities in Africa that I would argue run across pretty much all of these language systems. But then, of course, there are differences. There are differences that are embedded within those language systems and manifest themselves in many ways, not just the language system, but in other cultural expressions. Here's another look at the spread of African languages, particularly in post-colonial times. And the key here is, as I mentioned, that language is an expression of worldview. Language is an expression of meaning and self-identity. And therefore, one of the most powerful means of colonization that occurred on the continent did have to do with the imposition of a foreign language. Certainly that occurred initially via the spread of Islam and Arabic across the northern part of the continent primarily, and then certainly after the transatlantic trade, the spread of European languages. So today what you will find is many countries identifying an official language and a what would be called a national language, and then in some areas they even break it out into a language of commerce that is used if they don't want to acknowledge necessarily a foreign language, particularly a European language. The only countries that have chosen to keep or make their official language one that is one of the indigenous African languages is the Amharic in Ethiopia, Kinyarwanda in Rwanda, Kirundi in Burundi, Kiswahili in Tanzania, although of course Kiswahili is spoken in many parts of East Africa, Setswana in Botswana, and Tigrinya in Eritrea. Otherwise, Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, Spanish spoken the least in any countries, are actually the official languages and are probably the primary legacy of that colonial period. Essentially forcing a particular people to move in the direction of an identity that is not necessarily one that arises from them. Another humanities perspective that was discussed had to do with the variety of religious expressions that we find on the continent. On the left, what you see is pretty much a kind of current representation of the African religions, or the religions that exist in Africa, and pretty much the main ones. So you have Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Judaism. But also you see the indigenous religions that still hold great significance in pretty much every part of the continent, as you can see. Not as much, or at least not represented here as much in the north, although I might take issue with that, although I don't have the data to support the fact that indigenous religious practices continue to be practiced in the northern parts of the continent beyond the Sahara. Nevertheless, I think it is fair to say, and I've said this in other contexts, I'm not sure in this class, but regardless of the religious experience that has come from elsewhere, particularly Islam and Christianity and Hinduism and Judaism, what they met was a more indigenous religious perspective, a religious perspective or a religious system that was based on an African philosophy of life. And to change that would have meant to fundamentally change the human experience, or change the experience, or change the definition of how people saw themselves. While to some degree that has occurred, and the chapters on both Islam and particularly the one on Christianity in Africa speak to this in terms of how it has really tried to change fundamentally who the African was and how the Africans saw themselves, it was not and cannot be, in my opinion, a complete transformation. And in many ways, those indigenous religious experiences have transformed Christianity and Islam and other things as opposed to the other way around, or at least as much as the other way around. The chapters also discussed the spread of those religions over time. Christianity, Islam, it talks about the migrations of people and how the spreading of those religions went with them and transformed in many ways what they found when they got there, and also the intersection or the in-migration of many experiences as well as religious experiences from the West and the North primarily. What is not listed on here is some of the more contemporary kinds of cultural impositions that are occurring from the West, primarily America, in many ways, and that's the case no matter where in the world you are looking at. And so that should be appreciated as well. I mentioned my dissatisfaction with the African creative expression, as it was covered at least in the chapters that I asked you to read. And one of the things in the art chapter, they talked about carvings and heads and things like that, but they didn't talk about masks. And African masks are particularly important to both the religious expression as well as the cultural expressions of the people. All art in Africa tends to be functional art. Whether you're talking about the mask of the King Tut mask that you see on the right, or you're talking about some of the sub-Saharan ethnic expressions that we see in some of the masks to the left, some of those used in ceremonies, all of which are representative of or symbolic of particular cultural expressions. And as I mentioned, all African creative expression tends to be functional and not just artistic. Only until recent years and the advent particularly of people coming in and finding value, commercial value in some of these art forms, have they been used for commercial purposes as opposed to either religious or purposes of cultural expression. And that's an important point when you think about African creative expression. The social sciences we tried to cover had to do with the economics of Africa over the course of many years, particularly the role that trade has played in both migrations as well as development. Political science aspects of it, the political experiences and transformations of from more subsistence and small communities to city-states, as well as the maintaining of many smaller community systems, and kind of why that was the case, why there was no imperative or pressure to change to large-scale political economic systems in many areas of the continent. The sociology of it, how people's come into contact with each other and interacted with each other. We did not talk certainly enough, or a lot I should say, about psychology of it. Take my class, as I mentioned before, but every interaction has both a social and psychological dimension to it. And those need to be appreciated, whether it's the interaction with your neighbors, as in most of African history had been, people who looked like you and people who had similar kinds of cultural expressions as you, or whether it was interaction with foreigners, with aliens, basically, people who come who don't look like you and bring very different worldviews, very different beliefs, very different behaviors. All of those have social and psychological dimensions to it. The discussion of the evolutionary linguistics, how we came to understand, for instance, the spread of the Bantu over several years, over several thousand years actually, and we came to discover that mostly through linguistic study as opposed to archaeological or other kinds of evidence. So the social sciences play a huge role in helping us to understand the history as well as the meaning of that history for the peoples who lived it. We did not speak as much to the physical sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, although there was certainly a coverage of the civilizations and the built civilizations that we reviewed. So we of course begin in the Nile Valley and a long history, the longest of all really, of in both Kemet as well as Nubia, the monuments, the carvings, the statues, and of course the Great Pyramid and the pyramids that existed there, and the scientific excellence, the scientific genius for creating all of that is a fascinating part of the story of African civilizations, and in so many ways has contributed to subsequent civilizations, particularly in the West, but some would argue in other parts of the world. the Great Zimbabwe and the ways is a prime example of the ways in which African communities saw and designed their communities in very purposeful ways, some having to do with threats from the outside, but mostly having to do with how the community saw itself as best functioning. Again, a great deal of expression of how people saw themselves. And then once you get an interaction with other parts of the world, and in particular when we look at the role that Islam has played in the transformation of many African societies, particularly in the sub-Saharan sub-Saharan but upper forest areas and savanna areas, we see very much an Arabic and Islamic influence. We also see that along the east coast of the continent, as was discussed before, and if you go to the west coast, very much European influence, particularly during the transatlantic trade. One of the things that, this may be a term that I have kind of coined, or at least is going to use here, this idea of metadisciplinary. And basically what we want to bring notice to is the fact that it does us a disservice to only focus on the African experience in kind of strict disciplinary ways. And so what we see within the Academy these days are areas that are cross-disciplinary, and I say metadisciplinary, picking and taking what is valuable and can add in combination to a deeper understanding of the African experience. So in the behavioral sciences, we can use anthropology, archaeology, sociobiology. We talked about evolutionary linguistics to understand migrations of people, why they did what they did, and why the history manifested itself like we saw it manifested itself. The other kind of meta-constructural aspects of that is when we talk about culture. Culture is, I define as the supreme creation of a human community. And as a supreme creation, it is an amalgamation of all of those dimensions, all of those aspects, all of those disciplinary perspectives. It is not just one. So when we see culture, we can talk about it in many different ways. We have to appreciate the worldview. We begin to understand how people attempt to fight and resist the kinds of oppression that they are faced with, whether it is being oppressed by the changing environment, for instance, the desiccation, the disappearance of the Sahara, or I shouldn't say the disappearance of the Sahara, the disappearance of the green Sahara to a more dry and inhospitable environment, the movement that forced the movement of those people, and then how they had to adjust. That is a more natural form of oppression. And then we have, of course, efforts by others coming in, whether it was the Islamic jihads, or whether it was people seeking more land, or whether it was European or Arab expansion. All of those things have are challenges that Africans in many different ways had to face and had to adjust to, that were oppressive in nature but had to be responded to in order to survive them in many ways. And the degree to which that survival was a just survival. It's hard to say, particularly when we look at ancient times, but we can see how now that plays itself out in more modern times. Environmental sciences, of course, the movement of people, human geography, all of those kinds of things. And as we move to modern day society, the question of development studies, given all of what we talked about, given all of what we have seen, given all of what we cannot ignore in terms of the history of the continent, and given the current global circumstances, how does that all come together? How does it all play itself out? And how can development occur in a more humanistic and just way than it has occurred in the past, particularly the past 300 to 400 years, as Africa tries to regain a foothold on competing in this global economy and global development. So, our disciplines and meta-disciplines have given us a understanding of the history of Africa, the diverse history of a continent, primarily focusing on the kingdoms, empires, and great civilizations. We've covered classical Egypt, of course, or Kemet, Kush, Ethiopia, Axum in the north, and the Horn. We've covered the Western Sudanic and the Western more coastal as well as forest areas, coming from particularly beginning with Ghana and Mali and Songhai, and of course Kanem Bornu. The Yoruba and Hausa land is not mentioned on this particular map. The Ashanti, of course, and the Oyo, which is pretty much north of the Yoruba. We talked about there was Benin and the Dahomey area as well. We didn't talk as much about the Wolof. And then the Central Africa, of course, Congo with a K as opposed to a C, Lunda, Luba, and then when we get to the southeastern areas, we particularly talked about Monomotapa or Zimbabwe. The Zulu Kingdom was mentioned briefly, and of course the Swahili civilizations, which was very diverse in many ways, and of course what took place on the island of Madagascar. So we try to get to most parts of the continent. I have not to this point, but I'm looking forward to reading your civilization papers that cover some of these, but mostly those that are not listed here, and how they manifest themselves in different ways. And the fact that it did not have to be a great, noticeable, built, politically complex society in order to be one that had great impact on the development and the history of and the progress of the continent itself. The last chapter that you were asked to read had to do with the transatlantic trade. And this image, of course, speaks to the dispersion of the involuntary dispersion of African people across the world, and particularly to the west, to North and South America and the islands. It spoke to both the negative impact that trade, beyond most other experiences, had on the continent and the people, and the development that has hampered the ability to develop in line with other places around the globe up to this day. And it also spoke to the benefit gained, particularly by Europeans who themselves voluntarily migrated to the North and South America, and the benefit that they gained from the enslavement over hundreds of years of a group of people. Post-enslavement, we see, particularly on the continent of Africa, beginning in the 1890s at the Berlin Conference, or 1880s, 90s at the Berlin Conference, where European powers decided to carve up the continent, the beginning of colonialism. This map here essentially points to how all of that turned out, with the continent being colonized in many ways by Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the very small areas that would be considered Liberia. Those, of course, Empire Ethiopia, and Liberia, which I guess is independent in some respect, which has a legacy of repatriated Africans coming back from America as well as in other parts of the continent, as well as in Liberia, where people were repatriated back from Europe as well, primarily Britain. And so you can debate whether or not that was actually independence as much as a kind of neo-colonialism, perhaps the first official kind of neo-colonialism, with the latter taking place after the independence movements beginning in 1957, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Many of the independence movements also took place, or the independence of many of the countries in northern Africa took place prior to 1957, but Ghana being the first for it to take place in sub-Saharan Africa. That impact of that colonialism, after the negative impact that had taken place during the enslavement and the taking from the country millions of African beings who were therefore not then able to contribute to the continued development, particularly the independent development of their country, had a great impact on the continent as a whole. What we see now, post-independent, post-colonial, post-independent Africa, or the post-times when African countries became independent, the continued experiences that in many ways the processes are the same as what we have seen all the way from ancient times. The migrations, the movement, the development, the dispersion, the cultural integration, the economic integration, all of those things that contributed in one way or another to the development of these great or these ancient civilizations, and the development of peoples, and the sharing of ideas and the sharing of knowledge. All of these things continue to take place in very many ways. All of them continue to be impacted by all of these continue to take place within a global context, but now more so than ever, because the immediacy of and the connections that people have across the globe are so much more tangible, are so much more instantaneous, are so much more possible, the connections that people have in both real as well as virtual ways. And so we see a continued impact on the continent from all kinds of directions, both coming in as well as going out. And so Africa remains what it has always been, a dynamic foundation in many ways to other parts of the world, where it is both being affected by and affecting these other parts of the world. And many of those effects are positive, but many, and unfortunately I would probably argue many more, are not so positive. And the challenges that Africa and the global community as well have of making the less positive ones not so. Our development studies, which we mentioned in kind of a meta-theoretical way, I think has also given us a very good way to understand how things take place. One of the films I asked you to review was the Guns, Germs, and Steel film, which tried to make the point that we need to move away from this idea that African development in Africa is I'm about to say retarded, which is true, not retarded in a psychological sense, but is retarded in the sense that it is pressed down upon. It cannot move as it should for a lot of different reasons, and did not occur for a lot of different reasons, some of which, of course, was the imposition of other groups on that development. But it also had a great many environmental and ecological reasons for it. The ability of any group of people to take advantage of their environment is dictated in many ways by what that environment provides, and how the favorability of that environment can differ across the globe simply based upon geographical location. And in Africa, being such a large continent, and one that more than any other continent covers both the northern hemisphere as well as the southern hemisphere, as well as the tropical areas, very fertile areas, as well as very areas that are very inhospitable. All of that has played into the ability of Africa to develop. So understanding that environmental and ecological history is very much important to understanding what the consequences have been, both in terms of what we have seen in history as well as in what is possible. Political, economic history and their consequences, as well as the social, psychological history and the consequences, and how the movement of peoples and the interaction of peoples. All of that is where we are now in terms of Africana studies being able to contribute to the future, the present as well as the future development of a continent and of a people. I'm not going to say much about this image. I'm just going to put it up there, and I want you to just take a look at it. Look at the ecological diversity that it presents. All of what we have talked about, history, culture, migrations, opportunity for development, challenges to development, changes over time of what we see right here. All of this has been development by, has been affected. All of that has been affected by what we have here. We have a continent at, we'll just call it the center of the world, bordered by seas and oceans, rivers that traverse it, the Great Rift Valley, lakes, mountains, most of the continent just all the way up in the air. Coastal areas, all of that is the opportunity, and then just the influx of people from the other places coming to the opportunity that they saw, as well as leaving in many cases the opportunity that they could not quite get a hold of. This image for me kind of just captures it all, because it tells so many stories if you take the time to appreciate them. My final thoughts, I hope you have found as useful, that you continue as African scholars and those of us interested in African civilizations. We continue to find new knowledge. We continue to gain greater understanding. We have to have an appreciation for the fact that history is too often a story of the few and not the common. It's mentioned in the text, and I've mentioned it, that we talk about primarily men. We talk about those who were the conquerors. We talk about the elite, the rulers, those who benefited from everything. We talk about the upper crust of the society. We talk less, although we try to talk more in this course and in the readings, about just the common people. From my view, those are the stories where we really get the real. Those are the places we really get the real story. Humanity, our own humanity, is basically a story of the day-to-day living, how we negotiate our lives in the environment we find ourselves in, and with the people with whom we find ourselves connected to. The African proverb states, until the lioness has her own storyteller, the best part of the tale will always go to the hunter. It is our challenge, therefore, to not just accept the stories that we have had up to this point, and those stories have been primarily those of the hunter, those of the conqueror, and to begin to tell those of not just those who were conquered, but those who were just trying to go about their lives on a day-to-day basis. Peace and thank you.